and occupied Donetsk, all converging on a single target. The drones skimmed the treetops at nearly 75 miles per hour, while the missiles plunged from the stratosphere at over 4,500 miles per hour. This was no mere strike. It was a decapitation blow aimed at Ukraine's largest logistics hub, threatening to cripple the entire Western Front. In seconds, the calm would shatter, and what followed would become a lesson in modern warfare. The warning came only seconds after the calm was broken. Deep beneath the soil, radar arrays hidden inside reinforced bunkers flickered to life, their screens flooding with signals of the incoming swarm. Operators called out trajectories as dozens of hostile UAVs and 3 ballistic missiles closed in on Yavoriv. The order went out instantly. Launch the interceptors. From concealed launch pads, bayonet combat drones shot into the sky in pairs. Designed for one mission, only drone-on-drone combat, they climbed fast and then dove headlong into the Russian formation. Each collision triggered a directional charge, scattering debris in fiery bursts that lit the horizon. Within minutes, what had seemed an unstoppable swarm was unraveling in midair. But the greater threat still screamed down from above. The 3 Iskander warheads, each carrying the explosive equivalent of a half-ton of TNT, tore through the stratosphere at more than 4,500 miles per hour. On the ground, Ukrainian crews manned their Patriot Pack-3 batteries. At the command, launch tubes ignited, sending interceptors streaking skyward at blinding speed. White contrails carved across the morning sky before erupting in brilliant fireballs. More than 25,000 feet up, each one marking the destruction of a Russian missile that had been seconds from impact. The base below still stood untouched. Ukraine had prevented annihilation in the opening strike. Yet inside the command bunker, every officer knew this was only the beginning, the first test of a battle that was about to escalate. The air above Yavoriv still shimmered with the trails of destroyed missiles when the next phase of Ukraine's defense began. Commanders inside the underground bunker knew that simply surviving the opening strike wasn't enough. Russia had committed massive resources, and more waves would surely follow. Rather than waste strength on an immediate large-scale counterattack, the Ukrainian High Command chose a different path, one as old as warfare itself: guerrilla tactics. Small units of just 3 to 5 soldiers were dispatched across the contested zone. Lightly armed but highly mobile, they rode motorcycles fitted with suppressors, rocket launchers, and satchel charges, slipping through backwoods trails and abandoned farm roads. Their mission wasn't to hold ground, but to bleed the invader through speed, shock, and fear. One night, a Russian fuel convoy of a dozen trucks rumbled down a rural highway. Out of the tree line, Ukrainian riders appeared, firing a volley of shoulder-mounted rockets. Within seconds, 3 trucks were engulfed in flames, sending towers of black smoke into the night sky. Before Russian escorts could react, the guerrillas vanished into the forests, their engines drowned by the roar of the fire. At dawn, another team struck a communications hub. A few well-placed charges silenced Russian radios across the sector for hours, leaving frontline units blind and confused. Elsewhere, patrols disappeared into ambushes, their attackers leaving no trace but shell casings and charred wrecks. The psychological toll was immediate. Russian formations began to unravel, soldiers firing blindly into the darkness, convoys refusing to move without heavy escort, and platoons refusing to leave trenches at night. Every rustle of leaves became an imagined ambush, every shadow a phantom enemy. By the 7th day, Ukrainian intelligence estimated that 60% of Russian combat effectiveness in the sector had evaporated not through open battle, but through exhaustion, paranoia, and fear. From the command bunker at Yavoriv, generals watched the reports pour in. Their gamble was working. What Russia thought would be a knockout blow had instead opened the door to a war of shadows, one where Ukraine dictated the rhythm, and every hour of silence carried the promise of another strike. The week of guerrilla raids had done its work. Russian troops along the sector were drained, paranoid, and hesitant to move. That was the exact moment Ukrainian commanders had been waiting for. With the enemy unsettled, it was time to unleash something far bolder. A storm of drones unlike anything Russia had yet faced. At dawn, hidden farm fields and improvised airstrips across western Ukraine came alive. From them, nearly 300 low-cost suicide UAVs rose into the sky in buzzing swarms. Each drone weighed less than 60 pounds, carried a modest 15-pound explosive charge, and was guided by little more than a cheap GPS chip and a camera, no different than one sold at an electronics store. Their frames had been 3D printed in workshops, powered by commercial lithium batteries, and assembled by engineers working through the night. They were crude compared to Russia's precision weapons, but the philosophy was simple. Win with numbers, not price tags. As the swarm closed on Russian staging grounds near Samir, enemy anti-air systems erupted. Surface-to-air missiles worth millions of dollars each streaked into the sky, tearing apart dozens of drones. Yet for every one destroyed, several more slipped through. In the chaos, 5 UAVs veered dangerously off course, their GPS receivers scrambled by Russian jamming. For a brief moment, disaster loomed. The drones were drifting toward a Ukrainian artillery battery preparing to fire. Had they struck, over 120 soldiers and 6 howitzers could have been lost. That was when Ukraine's electronic countermeasures, ECCM, kicked in. Portable frequency-hopping transmitters pulsed through the air, overwhelming the Russian interference. Operators on the ground seized back control of the rogue drones and redirected them with new coordinates. With a sharp correction, the UAVs wheeled around and dove not into friendly guns, but into a Russian ammunition depot. The explosion was colossal. A fireball climbed hundreds of feet into the air, the shockwave rattling windows for miles. Flames devoured stacks of shells and propellant, sending secondary blasts echoing across the battlefield. What had nearly become a friendly fire tragedy had instead turned into a strike of devastating effect. Russian crews watched in disbelief as fuel trucks ignited like volcanoes and artillery batteries collapsed under cascading detonations. For Ukraine, the storm of drones had proven its worth. Technology that cost only a few $1,000s apiece had overwhelmed weapons worth hundreds of times more. The guerrilla war of shadows had softened the enemy. Now, the drone storm had cracked their defenses wide open, paving the way for the next decisive phase of the counteroffensive. The Russian base near Samir was already reeling from the devastation of the drone storm. Columns of black smoke curled upward, fuel depots burned like giant torches, and artillery positions lay shattered. But for Ukraine, the drones were only the beginning. With the enemy's air defenses broken and morale collapsing, the order came down: move in the heavy firepower. From concealed firing positions, 30 self-propelled artillery pieces thundered to life. Guided by real-time data from reconnaissance, UAVs circling high above, each round landed with pinpoint accuracy. Shells tore through surviving Russian armor, collapsing trench lines and silencing machine gun nests. The ground shook as salvo after salvo ripped apart strongpoints that had once seemed impenetrable. Then came the steel advance. 10 modernized T-64 tanks, engines roaring, rolled out of camouflage positions and drove straight into the smoldering perimeter. Their 125mm cannons unleashed one crushing blast after another, demolishing bunkers and blasting through makeshift barricades. Each hit sent dirt, debris, and shattered concrete flying, leaving nowhere safe for defenders to hide. Close behind the tanks thundered 15 armored trucks carrying more than 550 elite Ukrainian infantrymen. They dismounted swiftly, breaking into squads that split in multiple directions like shadows racing across the battlefield. Their mission was clear: seize the ruined base, neutralize any resistance, and capture intelligence before the Russians could regroup. Hovering just overhead were miniature quadcopter drones, no larger than a backpack. Their infrared cameras swept through rubble and tree lines, searching for the faint heat signatures of Russian soldiers attempting to hide. Every detection was instantly relayed to infantry squads on the ground. Within minutes, concealed positions were exposed and eliminated, sometimes with a handful of grenades, sometimes with a short burst of rifle fire. The assault was relentless. Russian defenders, already stunned from the drone onslaught, now faced artillery raining from above, tanks crushing their fortifications, and infantry squads closing in with uncanny precision. With every block of resistance collapsing, the Ukrainian advance grew faster and bolder. What had begun with cheap drones had now shifted into a full combined arms assault. Ukraine wasn't just breaking defenses anymore, it was reclaiming ground, step by step, turning a shattered battlefield into a proving ground for modern, coordinated warfare. The thunder of tanks and the crack of artillery had broken the Russian perimeter, but inside the shattered base, resistance still flickered. As Ukrainian infantry pushed deeper, reports came in of a pocket of defenders refusing to yield. Nearly 40 Russian soldiers had barricaded themselves inside a reinforced warehouse, dragging in heavy machine guns and ammunition. From behind its steel walls, they raked the advancing infantry with bursts of fire, forcing the Ukrainians to pause. Instead of a costly frontal assault, the order was given to call in the hunters. Overhead, a swarm of loitering mini-drones, each no larger than a bird, began circling silently in the night sky. Equipped with small cameras and carrying just a few pounds of explosives, they were designed for one purpose: precision strikes against dug-in enemies. Moments later, the drones dove. One by one, they dropped from the sky, their motors whining as they nosed into the warehouse roof. Explosions rippled across the structure, first small flashes, then a roaring chain reaction as stored ammunition ignited. In seconds, the warehouse became a fireball, flames bursting through shattered windows, silencing the last organized Russian defense inside the base. The few survivors bolted, abandoning their weapons and sprinting into the tree line at the edge of the compound. But even the cover of night could not save them. High above, reconnaissance UAVs tracked their heat signatures, marking every movement on live feeds. Coordinates were fed directly to Ukrainian squads on motorcycles who tore through the forest trails at high speed. Engines roared, headlights cut the darkness, and within minutes the riders were on them. Short bursts of rifle fire ended the chase. Grenades thrown into thickets flushed out the last stragglers. By midnight, silence returned to the battlefield. The base was smoldering, warehouses reduced to twisted steel, and the forest echoed only with the distant hum of Ukrainian drones still circling. The final Russian attempt at defense had been extinguished. What had begun as a fortified position was now a graveyard lit by flames, a reminder that in this war, even the shadows belong to Ukraine. The flames from the warehouse still smoldered when a new threat appeared on the horizon. At first light, Russian high command sought revenge. From airfields deep inside occupied territory, 10 fighter bombers Su-34 Second and Su-35 Second took off, loaded with precision-guided bombs, each capable of leveling entire buildings in a single strike. Their mission was simple: wipe the Yavoriv base off the map and erase Ukraine's victory from the night before. As the jets streaked westward at nearly 600 miles per hour, Ukrainian troops on the ground braced for impact. Sirens wailed across the compound. Soldiers scrambled into bunkers, while radar crews locked onto the incoming formation. But unknown to the Russian pilots, during the night, Ukraine had quietly redeployed a battery of Patriot PAC-3 interceptors around the base. When the fighters entered the kill zone, the order came. In a flash, 7 Patriot missiles ignited, trailing bright arrows against the building stock. Within seconds, one Su-34 disintegrated into a fireball at 20,000 feet. Another spiraled downward in flames, crashing into the forests miles away. By the end of the volley, 7 Russian aircraft were downed. The remaining 3 panicked, dumping their bombs harmlessly into empty fields before fleeing east. From the trenches and command posts, cheers erupted. Ukraine had not only survived, but turned the tables. For the first time in the battle, the skies no longer belonged to Russia. The wreckage of Russian jets still smoldered in distant fields when the scale of Ukraine's achievement came into focus. Against overwhelming odds, Yavoriv had stood firm. In less than 48 hours, Ukraine had faced down a 3-pronged Russian assault drones, ballistic missiles, and modern fighter jets, and turned each one back. The base still stood, the flag of Ukraine flying proudly above it, a symbol not only of survival but of defiance. The consequences were profound. Russia had poured enormous resources into the attack: advanced warplanes, cutting-edge missiles, and swarms of drones. Yet the result was catastrophic failure. Hundreds of Russian vehicles were destroyed, stockpiles of fuel and ammunition went up in flames, and more than 300 soldiers surrendered rather than face annihilation. Most devastating of all, Russia's supposed air superiority had been shattered, 7 jets falling in a single morning. The balance of power in western Ukraine had shifted, but larger questions now loomed. If low-cost UAVs and improvised weapons could cripple such an assault, was any Russian stronghold truly safe? And how would Moscow respond after such a humiliating defeat? Would it double down with heavier firepower, or search for another front to exploit? The lesson from Yavoriv was clear. Modern war is no longer decided only by missiles worth millions, or aircraft costing tens of millions. It is shaped by creativity, coordination, and the unshakable will of those who refuse to yield. Ukraine had proven that determination and ingenuity could turn weakness into strength. Above the battlefield, the white contrails of Patriot missiles still lingered in the sky, while below, Ukrainian soldiers guided captured Russian prisoners out of the ruins, a closing image both brutal and deeply human. At exactly 3:42 a.m., under a blanket of dense fog, the town of Kupiansk lay silent, its streets empty, its streetlights casting weak halos in the mist. Just 14 miles from the Russian border, the air carried a stillness that belied the violence about to unfold. The target was a critical artery in Russia's war machine, a steel railroad bridge spanning the Oskol River and the massive freight transfer station just south of it. Together they formed the lifeline for Moscow's supply chain, into the Luhansk front, delivering artillery shells, rocket pods, diesel fuel, and spare parts for tanks grinding away in eastern Ukraine. The bridge stretched nearly 700 feet from bank to bank, its trusses silhouetted faintly against the dim glow of the horizon. Beneath it, the Oskol's dark waters rolled slow and cold, masking the approach of danger. The transfer station, half a mile downstream, was a sprawling maze of freight cars, fuel tankers, and stacked shipping containers, each marked with stenciled Cyrillic warnings. Over the past week, reconnaissance drones had tracked constant movement here. Trains arriving every 2 hours, convoys of trucks loading under floodlights, soldiers moving crates under tarps. Satellite imagery showed a growing stockpile of munitions, an unmistakable sign that Russia was preparing another push toward Lyman. But tonight, the bridge and the station were not just logistical hubs. They were targets. And somewhere beyond the fog and the river, an incoming strike force was already closing the distance, silent, unseen, and minutes away from turning this quiet stretch of rail into twisted steel and burning wreckage. For Moscow, the Oskol River Bridge and the freight transfer station weren't just infrastructure. They were the beating heart of their eastern supply line. Losing them would mean severing the direct rail link to Lyman, forcing every shipment of ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts onto slower, more vulnerable truck convoys. The Kremlin knew this, and it had fortified the area accordingly. On the western bank, a Panzer S-1 air defense system crouched in the shadows, its twin 30mm autocannons and 12 missile tubes angled toward the sky. Less than a mile away, the 1L-122 radar station scanned in a constant sweep, searching for anything with a heat signature or radar return out of place. The Russians had also strung a web of anti-drone floodlights along the tracks and loading yards, their beams slicing through the night like prison searchlights. To the untrained eye, it looked impenetrable layers of technology, overlapping fields of fire, and the steady hum of machinery keeping watch. But to an experienced strike planner, it also had gaps, radar blind spots where the riverbanks dipped low, timing delays in the Panzer's targeting cycle, and the simple fact that light only works if you can see through the fog. And on this night, the fog was relentless. A damp chill settled over the valley, the temperature hovering just above 37°F. Visibility was barely 100 feet thick enough to hide a man walking across the yard, let alone a drone flying nap of the earth along the waterline. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Russian optics, something was moving toward the bridge. The defenses were ready for a fight, just not for the kind of fight that was coming. Beyond the fog-draped hills, Ukraine's strike package was already in motion. 18 long-range attack drones, a mix of Beaver and Scythe models, each loaded with precision-guided warheads. They weren't coming in high, loud, or fast. Instead, they hugged the Earth in a textbook nap of the Earth profile, skimming barely 20-30 feet above the Oskal's dark waters. At that altitude, the river itself acted as a radar shield, bending and scattering any signal that might betray their approach. The formation split miles before the target. Two strike groups, each with 6 drones, banked south to line up on the sprawling freight transfer station. Their mission was to gut the facility, hit the fuel tanks, detonate the ammunition stacks, and ignite the container yards until nothing inside could be salvaged. The third group, also 6 drones strong, stayed on the river, threading between frost-covered trees and under abandoned utility lines. Their heading was locked on the steel span of the Oskal Bridge, a single strike point that could paralyze Russian rail logistics for weeks. Each drone's onboard navigation blended GPS with inertial systems and terrain-matching software. Even if Russia's jammers lit up, the drones could fly blind, following stored 3D maps of the valley to within a few feet. Their electric motors purred softly, nearly indistinguishable from the ambient hum of the night. The fog, which had been Russia's ally in concealing troop and cargo movements, now became Ukraine's shield. Floodlights cut brilliant cones into the mist, but their beams stopped dead in the murk, leaving vast blind zones. Radar operators saw nothing but the static wash of ground clutter. Minute by minute, the drones closed in, invisible to both eye and screen. When they reached the strike envelope, they would hit almost simultaneously bridge, station, and fuel yard, leaving Russia with no time to react, no space to recover, and no way to move supplies forward. They crossed the final half-mile in absolute silence, their matte black fuselages nearly invisible against the fog-dimmed river. The lead formation 3 Beaver drones, armed with 66-pound concrete-piercing warheads, rose just high enough to clear the last line of trees. Their flight computers locked onto the center span of the Oskal Bridge, where 2 massive support columns rose from the riverbed like stone sentinels. At 3:46 a.m., the first drone slammed into the eastern pillar. The warhead punched through reinforced concrete before detonating, sending a shockwave so violent that it rattled windows in the small settlement 2 miles away. Before the echo had faded, the second drone hit the opposite column, tearing open a jagged fracture that bled chunks of stone and twisted rebar into the water below. The third drone drove straight into the center truss, its explosion producing a spray of molten steel that rained down onto the ice-flecked river surface. On the west bank, the Russian Panzer S, 1 air defense battery came to life. Search radars spun, missile tubes elevated, and autocannons barked into the fog. But they weren't firing at the bridge attackers. Above them, at about 165 feet, a lone scythe drone acted as bait-blinking heat signatures, broadcasting false radar returns and weaving erratically to mimic a larger swarm. The decoy drew the Panzer's full attention. Its guns spat tracer fire into the night, chasing the Phantom, while missile locks cycled uselessly through false targets. In those critical seconds, the real strike drones at river level went unchallenged. By the time Russian operators realized their mistake, it was too late. The eastern column was already cracked through its core. The western footing was listing, and the central span sagged like a bowstring under strain. A deep groan of metal carried across the valley, a warning that the bridge's death was not just imminent, but inevitable. The breach was complete. Russia's untouchable supply artery had been mortally wounded in less than 60 seconds, and the real storm had yet to arrive. They broke from the river at less than 200 yards out, 3 Beaver drones in the lead, each carrying a 66-pound concrete-penetrating warhead designed to punch through reinforced steel and stone. Their flight path was locked on the Oskal Bridge's central support pier, the single structural point that, if destroyed, would drop the span into the river below. The drones came in low and fast, barely 15 feet above the water, their composite frames almost invisible to radar. In the fog, they looked like nothing more than drifting shadows until they climbed in unison for the final approach. At 300 feet from the target, each drone's electric motor whined into a sharper pitch as they accelerated to over 120 miles per hour. The first impact came like a cannon shot, the warhead boring deep into the pier before detonating. A shockwave rolled through the valley, rattling windows in the houses a half-mile away. The second drone struck 3 seconds later, hitting the opposite side of the pier and shattering the main rebar lattice. The third followed almost instantly, delivering the final blowstone and steel bursting outward in a cloud of debris, the deep thud of collapsing concrete echoing over the water. On the western bank, a Panzer S-1 air defense unit snapped awake. Its targeting radar swung toward the river, and in seconds the twin 30mm cannons were spitting fire into the fog. Tracers lit up the night, stitching glowing arcs into the mist. But the gunners were chasing ghosts. 50 meters above the bridge, two decoy drones were weaving erratically, broadcasting false radar signatures and drawing every shot the Panzer could throw. While the cannons tracked upward, the real strike drones were already clear of the engagement zone, their mission complete. The bridge still stood for now, but the heart of its structure was gone. Every passing second brought it closer to collapse, and the Russian defenders had no idea the worst was yet to come. The blast at the bridge was only the opening note. Less than 5 seconds later, the rest of the strike package swept in from the South 12 drones fanning out over the sprawling freight transfer station. From above, the facility looked like an industrial labyrinth. Rows of fuel tankers, stacked shipping containers, flatbed rail cars loaded with crates, all lit by floodlights bleeding into the fog. The first wave hit the fuel yard. 6 Scythe drones dove almost vertically, each carrying a 44-pound high-explosive charge engineered to ignite volatile liquids. The impacts were staggering, warheads punching through tanker hulls, splitting steel like paper. One detonation touched off a chain reaction. Fuel geysered into the air, igniting mid-flight and cascading back down in sheets of fire. The yard became an inferno, orange flames curling hundreds of feet into the night sky. The second wave banked hard toward the container stacks. 3 drones targeted rows marked with hazardous material symbols, their warheads shattering the thin walls and spraying burning fuel across neighboring cars. Within seconds, the fire leapt to a train loaded with artillery shells idling on the adjacent track. What happened next was chaos in its purest form. The first shell cooked off with a sharp crack, followed by another, then another, until the night was filled with a deafening staccato, like a string of giant firecrackers tearing the air apart. Entire boxcars blew open, steel fragments spinning across the yard. A blast wave knocked over floodlight towers, plunging half the facility into shadow. Russian troops scattered, some diving for cover behind concrete barriers, others frozen in place, staring at the sky in disbelief. The anti-air gunners tried to bring the Panzer's cannons to bear, but the flames, smoke, and confusion turned their targeting screens into a blur of static. In less than 2 minutes, the fuel yard was gone, the container stacks were burning, and the ammunition train was nothing but twisted metal. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning diesel. And somewhere in that darkness, the drones still hadn't finished their work. The roar of secondary explosions still echoed through the valley when the bridge finally gave way. Already weakened by the initial strike, its central pier could no longer bear the load. With a groan of tearing steel and snapping rivets, the bridge didn't fall all at once. For nearly 30 seconds, it groaned under its own weight, concrete dust spilling into the river like smoke. Then, with a final cracking roar, a 215-foot span collapsed into the Oskil, sending a geyser of water and debris into the air. The rail line was severed completely inoperable for the foreseeable future. At the freight yard, the destruction was staggering. Satellite heat signatures later confirmed that 70% of the facility was either burning or reduced to rubble. 14 rail cars, many loaded with ammunition, were gone, reduced to twisted steel frames. More than 40 shipping containers were engulfed in flames, their contents boiling, bursting, or simply incinerated. The fuel yard was an unrecognizable crater, still glowing orange from residual fire. Black smoke billowed thousands of feet upward, drifting east toward the border. Communications from Russian logistics units abruptly went silent. The entire sector's supply network had just been amputated. And in the smoldering dark, the only sound was the hiss of burning metal and the slow, echoing collapse of what had once been the heart of Russia's rail lifeline to the east. By dawn, Russian commanders were already facing an operational nightmare. With the Oskil Bridge lying in the river and the Kupiansk transfer yard reduced to ash, the Army's primary supply artery to the Lyman-Seversk sector was gone. Analysts estimated it would take at least 3 weeks to restore even partial rail service. Until then, every round of artillery ammunition, every gallon of diesel, and every replacement part for tanks or APCs would have to move by truck on a route more than 95 miles longer than before. That detour wound through exposed highways and narrow rural roads, all within range of Ukrainian drones, Hawaii Mars strikes, and partisan ambushes. For Russian logistics officers, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a widening kill zone. Every extra mile meant more fuel consumed, more drivers exposed, more convoys to guard. The precision strike hadn't just damaged infrastructure, it had surgically removed a critical node in Russia's entire Eastern Front strategy. And somewhere in Kyiv, planners were already mapping the next weak link to cut. In the end, it wasn't billion-dollar bombers or massive armored offensives that severed Russia's eastern lifeline. It was a swarm of drones worth only tens of thousands of dollars. Precision, planning, and timing had turned low-cost machines into a force multiplier, toppling a strategic hub valued in the hundreds of millions. The lesson was as stark as the black smoke still curling over the Oskil. In modern war, supply lines are not defended by distance or fortifications.